This section explains what makes a mind tractable to study, and it hands you a question you can reuse on any field that claims the mind. A mind becomes tractable the moment you stop asking what it is and start asking what it does. It represents, meaning something stands for something else, and it transforms, meaning operations act on those stand-ins. Two operations, and that pair is the definition itself. This is why the computer became the founding analogy. A processor is nothing but store and manipulate, the same two moves. The second, quieter primitive is that cognitive science is an intersection rather than a single discipline. Philosophy, linguistics, neuroscience, and artificial intelligence all converge on one object because no single lens resolves the most complex entity known. So the chapter hands you a generator rather than a fact. Whenever a field claims the mind, ask this: what does it take as representation, and what transformation does it license? This section explains why the whole book treats mind as an information processor and what follows from that one wager. Mind treated as an information processor, that is the whole wager, and everything downstream is its unpacking. An information processor must do exactly two things: represent, meaning hold something that stands for something else, and compute, meaning transform what it holds. So mind decomposes into representation plus process, and the book's 13 approaches into representation plus process, and the book's 13 angles on that one decomposition. The second, subtler move hides in the word science. Cognitive science is an intersection rather than a discipline. Philosophy, linguistics, neuroscience, and AI converging on a single object, defined by their overlap, not their sum. The field is a fixed point on mind, a body of doctrine it is not. Physical space had its sciences. This one turns the same method in not. Physical space had its sciences. This section explains why philosophy comes first among the approaches to mind, and what it does that none of the others can. Philosophy earns first place by posing rather than answering. It manufactures the questions that the empirical disciplines will spend the rest of the book attacking. Being theoretical and bound to no subject matter, it alone can define problems, criticize models, and point at what to research next. It stands outside every other approach and grades them. The chapter's thesis is that the great questions of mind arrive dressed as this versus that, mind or body, nature or nurture, conscious or not. The binary costume misleads. Each dichotomy fractures into a spectrum of positions the moment you press on it. Learn to generate the enduring question, and every later approach becomes predictable. Each one is a single committed answer to a question posed here. This section explains why philosophy belongs at the head of the sciences, using the mind and body problem as its master case. Philosophy earns its place by defining problems rather than solving them. It is the theoretical discipline that hands the empirical ones their questions. Its master case is the mind and body problem, the apparent binaries. The chapter lists monism against dualism, nature against nurture, look like rival answers, but they are really the two ends of a single axis. That axis is generated by two knobs. The first knob is how many kinds of substance the universe holds. The second, if the answer is two was. Fix the two knobs and every named position falls out as a coordinate on that axis. Idealism, physicalism, identity theory, dualism, each is a point in the space, not a doctrine standing on its own. Occam's razor is the selector here, biasing the choice toward a single substance. The chapter's own caution is the primitive to carry forward. Saying this versus that polarizes a space that is really continuous. This section explains why the dozen schools of psychology collapse to a single generating pattern. A dozen schools share one generating axis. The apparent profusion reduces to two orthogonal questions the mind keeps posing to itself. The first asks what the mind contains, voluntarism and structuralism, cataloging mental stuff. The second asks what the mind does, functionalism, gestalt, and psychoanalysis, stult, and psychoanalysis, stult, and psychoanalysis. Then there is one dynamic riding on top. Each movement arises as a counter-reaction to the last. Functionalism and gestalt rise against structuralism, and behaviorism rises against the very idea of mind. Learn those two axes plus the negation engine, and you can predict the next school before you read it. This is the chapter's real work in the book. Every later approach, cognitive, neuroscience, network, and AI, is one of these two questions re-asked in a new substrate. The taxonomy is the seed of the whole field, a generative structure that tells you what grows from it. This section explains why a crowd of psychology schools is really a small coordinate system. A dozen 20th century schools all press one question: what is mind? Yet they collapse onto two generators. Either mind is an inventory, voluntarism and structuralism cataloging its elements, or mind is a process, functionalism, gestalt, and psychoanalysis asking what it does. Each school ignites as a counter-reaction to the one before it. Each school ignites as a counter-reaction to the one before it. Fix those two axes. Content versus operation, together with the dialectic of revolt, and the chapter's profusion of theories stops reading as a crowd and starts reading as a coordinate system. That is the payload. A discipline's whole history is a low-dimensional space you can regenerate from its basis vectors rather than a list to memorize. This section explains the core move of the cognitive approach and why vision is the case. It gets proved on first. Take any mental capacity and it becomes a diagram of boxes joined by arrows. Each box is a stage that transforms information and passes it on, and each is blind to the other's internals. That is the whole cognitive move. The mind stops being behaviorism's black box and becomes a pipeline you can decompose, simulate on a computer, and test stage by stage. This chapter proves the method on its cleanest case: vision into pattern recognition, into attention, because perception is where the stages separate most visibly. Fodor's modules are the strong form of the box, hardwired, fast, informationally encapsulated. What you learn here, you rerun on memory, language, and problem solving. The phenomenon changes. The box and arrow grammar does not. This part explains how the mind becomes tractable the moment you draw it as a pipeline, boxes that transform information, arrows that carry it, each stage sealed from the next. That single diagram, the process model, is the chapter's generative primitive. Everything downstream, vision, pattern recognition, attention, is just this schema instantiated. Attention is just this schema input. Where behaviorism refused the interior, the cognitive approach renders it. Mind as information processor, the boxes taken seriously enough that Fodor calls them modules, innate, domain-specific, informationally sealed. The two classical assumptions are sequential stages and independent stages, and these are exactly what the connectionist chapters will later break. Read this as the flowchart hypothesis of mind, stated cleanly before its own refutation. This section explains why memory, imagery, concepts, and problem-solving belong together as one idea. The unifying move is detachment from the stimulus. Chapter 4. Handled information coming in. This chapter is everything the mind does once a representation is cut loose from the present environment, called high-level, present environment, called high-level precisely because the world is no longer holding the content in place. So memory, imagery, concepts, and problem-solving are one primitive scene, 4 times, an internal representation characterized by what it costs to hold and transform. Each of the 4 pays a different price. Memory pays in duration, capacity, and coding. Imagery pays in the choice of format, analog versus propositional. Concepts pay in defining versus typical features. Problem-solving pays in search through a state space. Each one buys independence from the immediate stimulus at the price of one specific access cost. That is the whole chapter. This part explains how memory divides into distinct stores and the single pattern that specifies all of them. Memory is not one thing. It fractures into functionally distinct stores, and each store is fully specified by 3 parameters: duration, capacity, and code. That triple is the chapter's generative primitive. Take sensory memory first. Its capacity is near unlimited, its duration is about 1 second, and its code is bound to the modality. Iconic for vision, echoic for sound. Working memory is different on all 3 axes. Its capacity is small. Its duration runs from seconds to minutes, and its code is recodable into acoustic, semantic, or visual form. Sperling's partial report method and the Peterson backward counting study fix those numbers empirically. The deeper move threads past memory into imagery, concepts, and problem-solving. Every so-called high-level faculty is a representation format, plus the operations it affords. It is the workbench, not the loading dock of Chapter 4. Once you hold that, you generate each remaining section yourself. You name what is stored, in what code, and what process reads it. This section explains why neuroscience appears in the book, and what work it does. Mind as brain is the implementational floor beneath the algorithm. Neuroscience enters the book not as a rival theory of cognition, but as the hardware description that constrains which information processing models from chapters 4 and 5 are physically buildable. The chapter makes a single move, the same cognitive operations already described functionally: object recognition, attention, memory, get, reread at the level of neurons, pathways, and cortex. Anatomy bounds the space of admissible algorithms. That is the whole generative primitive. Every method, whether lesion, single-cell recording, EEG, imaging, or stimulation, is just a way to bind a cognitive function to tissue. The car engine caveat marks the catch. Interdependent parts mean a deficit never cleanly localizes one function. This section explains what neuroscience contributes to the book as a whole. Every other approach in the book proposes an algorithm. This chapter supplies the floor those algorithms must run on. Neuroscience furnishes the implementational level, the hardware description that constrains. Which information processing models the psychological, cognitive, and network chapters may posit. A model incompatible with what neurons and cortex actually do is dead, regardless of its elegance. Read Marr's stratification downward, and the brain filters the space of admissible upper level. The chapter's discipline is cognitive neuroscience, the union that maps specific cognitive operations onto structure and physiology. Here is the boundary. Constraint stops short of identity. Knowing the substrate bounds the algorithm. It never, by itself, hands you the algorithm. This section explains how the network approach relocates cognition from the symbol to the edge. The chapter's single move is this. Meaning is not a token stored in a node. It is a pattern of activation spread across weighted connections. Change the wiring, and you change the thought. 3 sections rehearse. 1 claim at rising scale. Artificial neural networks give representation as distributed activity. Semantic networks give knowledge as hierarchical concept links. Network science gives the topology itself, indifferent to substrate. The binding surprise sits in that last one. Airline routes, epidemics, and brains obey the same connective laws, so structure, not stuff, carries function. This is where the book abandons the serial symbol processor of its earlier chapters. A mind becomes what a graph does, and you can already predict the next case. Any capacity is a shape of connection. This part explains one inversion, and everything the chapter builds follows from it. Meaning stops living inside a symbol and starts living between nodes. That single move is what the chapter is for. It runs against the book's default paradigm, where a concept is stored as a token and operated on serially. The network approach stores the concept as nothing but a pattern of activation, distributed across weighted connections, computed in parallel by many small units. Distributed in parallel by many small units. No symbol is needed. The primitive is substrate blind. The same connectivity mathematics governs neurons, semantic concept, property links, and the routes airlines fly. Once you hold that, the rest predicts itself, localist versus distributed coding, and why brains and epidemics share one structure. This part explains the evolutionary approach to the mind. The idea that a mind is grown by breeding rather than built by engineering. The chapter's single move is to run one loop, variation, inheritance, and selection through the substrate of cognition itself. Whatever a faculty does, ask what ancestral niche posed it as a survival problem, and the faculty's shape falls out as the answer. Seed. Caching birds grow, the memory that finding caches demands. Human reason sharpens on detecting cheaters rather than on abstraction. The generative primitive is this. Read any cognitive trait backward from the selection pressure that would have built it. This is why the chapter sets itself against the general purpose computer. Evolution yields a bundle of special purpose devices, each tuned to the demand that carved it. This section reads a mind backwards, through the niche that shaped it. Read any cognitive capacity through the niche that selected it. That inversion is the chapter. Mind is a bundle of special purpose devices, each one an answer to a specific ancestral demand, rather than a general purpose computer arrived from nowhere. Think of cache memory for a seed-storing bird or cheater detection for a reciprocal group. The generative move is this. To explain a faculty, don't ask what it computes. Ask what pressure, in what niche, would build it. Hence, the signature surprise. Logic collapses on abstract puzzles, yet it runs cleanly when the same problem is posed as catching a social cheat. The faculty is legible only through its environment. In the book's gallery of lenses, this one reads mind as the sediment of selection. This section explains why linguistics sits inside a cognitive science survey as its object, rather than as one of its lenses. Every other chapter in this book is a lens. This one is an object. Linguistics earns its place by subject matter rather than by perspective or method. It owns no method of its own. What it owns is language, the single phenomenon every discipline gathered here studies. The founding move is Chomsky's wedge against Skinner. You produce sentences you have never heard, so language cannot be a store of remembered responses. It must be a finite system of rules that generates infinite output. Generativity is the proof that the mind runs on rules. That proof is what cracked behaviorism and opened cognitive science itself. The linguistic approach, then, is where the field reads its own architecture off the structure of what we say. This section explains why language became the fault line between cognitive science and behaviorism, and it turns on a single property, generativity. A finite rule set over arbitrary symbols produces unboundedly many never-heard sentences. So speech cannot be learned as stimulus, response imitation, because most of what you say you have never heard. Chomsky's refutation of Skinner in 1959 turns on exactly this. The primitive to carry is this. Any system where finite structure generates an infinite well-formed space, a grammar, an axiom set, a recursive function, cannot collapse into a lookup table of remembered instances. The chapter's remaining machinery is the anatomy of that one generator, phonology, morphology, syntax, and semantics across nested timescales. Linguistics is singular for its object, language itself, and every method it wields is borrowed from a neighbor. This section explains the emotional approach, the view that treats mind as emotion. Every prior approach in this book treats feeling as residue, something cognition produces or merely tolerates. This one inverts the arrow. Emotion is the valuation the rest of cognition runs on. An emotion is an appraisal, a fast verdict on whether a situation helps or harms your goals, welded to a bodily signature. That verdict is what prioritizes. It tells a bounded mind what to attend to, which memory to wait, which option to discard before deliberation begins. Read it as the pruning function that makes otherwise intractable reasoning cheap enough to run. Damasio's patience, flawless in logic yet unable to choose, are the anchor. Computation without value cannot decide. This part explains how the body and the situation together produce an emotion. Arousal is generic. The situation names it. That is the chapter's whole move. The boyfriend is late opener and the Schachter and Singer adrenaline study land. 1 point. Identical bodily activation becomes fear, anger, or joy, according to the context appraised. Emotion is a flexible reflex. Many stimuli trigger it, many responses discharge it, and cognition selects among them. So the book folds emotion in as computation's coupling partner. The pure calculator picture of mind was simply incomplete. The 4 theories converge on the emergent synthesis. Some emotions fire raw from the amygdala without appraisal. Others demand interpretation. Several pathways, one system where thought and feeling continuously write each other. This part explains why cognition about people is not the same as cognition about objects. Earlier chapters assumed cognition is generic, the same machinery, whether you think about a tractor or your closest friend. This chapter breaks that assumption. The object of thought reshapes the mode of thought. A person is the one object that thinks back and models you modeling it. Call this mutuality, recursion without a fixed point. From that single asymmetry, the spine of Fisk and Taylor's people, versus Things table, everything downstream unfolds. Theory of mind is the capacity to run that recursion. Mirror neurons are its neural echo. Joint attention is its developmental seed. Autism is its failure mode. Mind becomes social because a dedicated apparatus exists for the objects that reciprocate, not because people are fed into a generic thinker. Now predict the rest. Wherever reciprocity appears, expect specialized machinery. This section explains why representing a person is categorically different from representing a thing. The individual-centered view of mind assumed cognition is generic, the same machinery, whether you think about a tractor or a friend. This chapter breaks that assumption. Representing a person is categorically unlike representing a thing, because the object of thought thinks back. A rock is inert to your model of it. A person models you. Modeling them acts differently when observable traits and changes over time. That single asymmetry, reflexivity in the represented system, generates every entry in the chapter's people, versus Things table, intentionality, mutuality, self-concept, and non-observable traits? Mind as society, then, is the claim that cognition aimed at other cognizers is a distinct regime, not a special case of object cognition. This section explains how the chapter fixes what artificial intelligence is. The move is to define it by one diagram rather than by its physical substrate, the intelligent agent. Facts and sensory signals go in, computational elements transduce them, and conclusions and actuators come out. Once the computer is that transducer, it stops being a tool and becomes a cognitive agent. It runs the same sense, reason, act loop that cognitive science already ascribes to the mind. Machine and mind now share one diagram. The lineage runs back to Wiener's cybernetic feedback, a set point compared against an achieved reference with the error driving correction, that is, homeostasis. Its limitation is that it serves one fixed goal, and surpassing that single goal is exactly why digital artificial intelligence is introduced. The primitive to carry forward is this. Symbolic artificial intelligence and connectionist artificial intelligence are two fillings of one agent slot rather than rival theories. Both fill the same diagram, the diagram that mind and machine hold in common. This part explains how intelligence factors into a single unit called the agent. An agent is anything that maps percepts to actions through reasoning, and the factoring stays silent about substrate. An algorithm counts as an agent. A robot counts too. The cupola, Wiener installs humans and machines alike as computational processes, turns the computer as cognitive agent from an analogy into an identity of type. Mind and machine become two instances of one kind, so building a reasoner already theorizes cognition, and that is the constructive test of the whole computational reading of mind. Everything the chapter then enumerates is variation in how the shared agent reasons, once you grant the agent as the unit. That list runs through symbolic versus connectionist approaches, if-then rules, fuzzy logic, the deductive, inductive, and abductive split, deep learning, and Bayes. This section explains the second half of the artificial intelligence approach, embedded intelligence, and robotics. Chapter 12 gave you intelligence as computation, the universal Turing machine's algorithmic half. This chapter is its other half, the control mechanism made physical, a body that senses and acts. The generative move is that once the machine must act in a world, rather than merely think about one, the world stops being input to a model and becomes part of the computation. That single inversion generates everything downstream. It gives you Breitenberg's vehicles, where complex behavior comes from, wiring alone, with no inner model. It gives you the split between reactive and deliberative architectures, swarms whose intelligence is distributed across many bodies, evolutionary robotics, and Brazil's Kismet reading a face. Predict a pattern anywhere. Wherever behavior can be pushed into the coupling with the environment, the head gets to hold less. This section explains embodiment as the subtraction of the internal model, and why competence can emerge from coupling alone. Chapter 12. Put intelligence inside. Symbols, a central model, a universal Turing machine grinding representations. This chapter removes the model and asks what survives. The answer, it's generative primitive, couple sensor to motor and let the environment close the loop. Competence then emerges from the coupling, not from anything that emerges from the coupling, not from anything the machine internally represents. The Breitenberg vehicle is the whole thesis in 2 wires. Cross them and the cart flees light, and an observer reads fear into a circuit that holds no concept of fear. So the chapter's law is one of attribution. Behavior looks smarter from outside than the mechanism warrants, because the world, not a stored map, supplies the intelligence. This section explains how the final chapter of a cognitive science survey moves the boundary of the mind outward, and why that one move changes everything downstream. 13 chapters treated cognition as computation inside the skull. This closing chapter moves the boundary outward. One relocation generates everything that follows. What does the cognitive work is not the brain alone, but the brain, body, and world loop. Your calloused finger conforming to an apple, a passive compliance, already computes part of the grasp, and an affordance is a fact about the organism and object pair, not a fact about the retina. Once the mechanism spans that loop, the classical ontology breaks along with it. Discrete symbols and serial modules give way to continuous trajectories through a state space. The system becomes interaction dominant rather than component dominant. Embodied, ecological, extended, and dynamical are 4 faces of one substitution. Displace where cognition happens, and its whole mathematics changes with the address. This closing section explains one move, redrawing where the cognitive system ends. Every prior chapter placed cognition inside the skull and asked what computation runs there. This final chapter redraws the cognizer's edge to enclose the body and its world. The generative move is a reclassification. What was treated as input to cognition, the finger pad conforming to the apple milliseconds before the nerve fires, the affordance a hammer offers a hand, gets reclassified as a constituent of cognition itself. Once the boundary is a choice rather than a given, the book's whole substrate question reopens. The question is no longer what runs the software, but where the cognitive system ends. Passive compliance and affordance are 2 anchors of one pattern. Intelligence offloaded from neuron onto morphology and onto ecology.